All right, thanks for that, Harsh. Now, the impact of this war, there is no doubt from everything that we've been hearing, as far as the charts, the numbers suggest, it has been acute. It continues to drive up losses of all kinds. So who are the winners and losers in this war so far? Why is diplomacy not being pursued by the global powers? That's the big question to answer. Let's bring this up with Distinguished ORF Fellow Manoj Joshi, who's joining us on this edition of India Tonight, along with former ambassador to USA and Germany. Meera Shankar is with us, and of course, ET Now's consultant and strategic affairs expert, Maroof Raza, is here as well. Great to have you all with us, but of course, not the best of times to talk about, because it's a year of war between Russia and Ukraine, something that the whole world is feeling the jitters of. Manoj Joshi, the Russia-Ukraine war has had this crippling impact on the global supply chain, for one. Because of it, we are seeing high inflation rates in countries around the world. Food prices have gone up, besides, of course, commodities like crude oil and metals. Now, without any end in sight to this war, how much further do you reckon it's going to damage the global economy, and in what kind of ways is it going to show up, the effect of this war in our daily lives?
Well, I think when the war began, most people did not factor in many of these issues. Meaning for example, the impact of the war on Ukrainian wheat exports or on fertilizers. So there is a whole set of areas which we never anticipated, because we never thought that this war would last this long. Now the war, as we are not celebrating, we are observing the anniversary, first year anniversary of this. And of course, there are questions in every mind. How long is it going to last? And frankly, I don't think anyone has an answer. If I were to be asked to guess, I would say the summer of this year is likely to be a point where there would be some kind of negotiation between the two parties. The recent signs, the Chinese 12-point statement that came out recently, could presage some moves in this. The tricky problem is that to end a war, to end this kind of a war, you require a situation where both sides can claim victory, in a sense. Neither side is willing to accept defeat. Now, this is a very tricky, difficult problem.
It's a difficult situation, one understands. Are they not being able to? Maroof, what do you think is the reason why we are nowhere near the end of this war? How much propulsion, for one, has the world's defense industry gotten from the Russia-Ukraine war, in your understanding? Has the ongoing war ignited this possibility of ballooning defense budgets in times to come even? Because frankly, nobody's talking about humanitarian relief, medicines, food, water, rebuilding shelters. The focus is perennially on more arms for Ukraine. How much the Chinese, for one, are helping the Russians militarily? This should be a net positive for the defense industry then, wouldn't it?
Well, I've said it on your show earlier, that wars end up becoming an exercise about big money.
Yes.
And they allow both sides to use that as an opportunity for arms sales, to exploit the battlefield, to test new weapons, and to help friends and allies with greater caches of weapons, and of course the money that is funded in. In the case of the US, it's officially poured in over $100 billion. If you cost the whole amount of money that the US will eventually put in, I would say it would go to $500 million. In the case of Europe, again, they are all hiking up defense budgets. Trump has been proved right, 2% spending on defense, and the Europeans having to foot the bill is becoming a reality. And the European holiday in the post-Cold War era of American security and Russian energy is all coming to an end. So the issue is, as Dr. Manoj Joshi has brought out, he doesn't see it ending. In fact, I don't see it ending much longer than this summer, because Russia hasn't won and Ukraine hasn't lost.
Correct.
And that
situation is not likely to change.
Yeah, which is suiting everybody. Two quick points that apart. Russia is now looking at a possible situation where it is going to use its pressures from US-led West to wean more towards China. China is the biggest gainer in this exercise, but will not always operate under the Russian umbrella. It's got its own global agenda. And the most important thing is India.
Yes.
India has shown that it can operate diplomatically independent of what people are calling extractive diplomacy. The US tried that with India, that, either you are with us or against us, but that argument failed. And at the end of the day, India is doing a tight balancing act, but coming out looking good, considering that the Europeans, and particularly France and Germany, are not being heard. Britain is making last minute efforts to be taken seriously, but it's still America which has found Europe as its new calling card after Afghanistan. Back to you.
But very importantly, Maroof, you talked about looking good. India is looking good, but it seems like everyone who's involved in this conflict wants to come away from it whenever that happens, in the summer or later, ending up looking good. Meera Shankar, you've served as a top diplomat from India in the US and Germany, the combined West that stands opposed to Russia right now. What do you think are the considerations they would have in ceding ground to Russia in an effort to end the war even? I mean, the larger question is, why has diplomacy failed so much in the modern world that we have a war where a superpower is involved and any effort at a ceasefire even is getting stonewalled?
Well, I think right now both sides seem ready to intensify the conflict.
Exactly.
If we read the signals from their leaders. On the one hand, you have Biden visiting Ukraine and saying that he's in it with for the long haul and will stand with Ukraine till the end. On the other hand, Putin's speech in the General Assembly also promising to dig in and readying the Russian people for a longish conflict. So it appears that from both sides, there is this feeling that the conflict could intensify. And maybe this is also to position themselves better. You see, both sides believe they haven't been exhausted as yet, and both sides believe that they can improve their position. I mean, today I was just seeing a headline that Russia has retaken Kherson. So, each side is trying to push for advantage, and they still believe that they can get a strategic advantage over their adversary. So as long as that is the belief, then I think the war will continue.
Manoj Joshi, how much of an impact have sanctions that have been imposed on Russia? How effective have they been? Several European nations that rely so highly on Russia for their natural gas needs, they've held back their purchases from Russia so that Russia's oil revenues can get dented. Towards the end of last year, the G7 put up that price cap of $60 per barrel on crude products. How much did that actually help in holding back the Russian will to keep fighting despite its, crumbling economy? War can never be good for the Russian economy either. So was it offset, you think, by the fact that emerging Asian economies like India have continued to buy crude at discounted prices from Moscow?
Definitely, the Russians anticipated some of this situation. They've had very skillful economic management, and they seem to be doing pretty well. But given the scope of the sanctions, you can be assured that more than anything else, these sanctions have a longer-term impact. And if you look at the gist of the Chinese statement today, one of the points they're making is that these sanctions should be lifted. See, over 150 Western companies have left Russia. They've just left Russia. So the sanctions will have a kind of an attritional effect on the Russian economy. So immediately, yes, Russian oil is being sold. We are buying it. They have the resources, and they have also reoriented their economy in such a manner that it's supporting the war that they are fighting. But inevitably, when you live on a war economy, your civilian economy goes for a 6. So the longer-term impact on Russia, I think, will be devastating. I have no doubt about that. And the break in the Russia-Europe energy connection, which I think will take a long time to repair. I mean, I'm not sure whether it can be ever repaired in the present circumstances. because this was a kind of a natural connection. I mean, Germany, Russia, Russian oil supply lines were going right through Ukraine, supplying a number of other countries. This break, I think, would be quite fatal for the Russians. So I think in the long term, the Russian, or medium to long term, the Russians are in big trouble.
Right.
In the short term, I think they've been able
They're
to
still
manage
holding out
the situation well.
Yes. Maroof, like Dr. Manoj Joshi is pointing out as well, perhaps Russia is better prepared. It got a taste of Western sanctions back in 2014 when it occupied the Crimea. It seems to be better prepared this time around. It's quite evident that Western sanctions haven't hit it too hard. At least the impact of that is going to be seen much later, not for the moment. In fact, transactions are happening in ruble now. Putin is seeking out investments for his country. He's promising economic and political stability. That's the kind of language we're hearing from him. It does get curiouser and curiouser, doesn't it? Would it be fair, Maroof, to say that the Americans would perhaps not like to see an end to the war because it may end their hegemony and that of the US dollar as well, which is getting back in, as far as the world is concerned, the war is helping the strength of the US dollar.
Yeah, it's helping the strength of the US dollar. Certainly, even if it isn't, the Americans are going to go and print more dollars. So don't take the dollar sinking as a point of reference about how this war is going to go. The second thing is that the Americans are basically battling on two fronts strategically, one in Europe and one against China. And they are going to go in for what Paul Kennedy long ago talked about, the rise and fall of great powers, strategic overstretch. And that strategic overstretch is an expensive business. The third thing is that as far as Russia is concerned, I don't entirely agree with Dr. Manoj Joshi, though I concede that he's very well informed, because eminent analysts like Swaminathan Iyer wrote a few months ago that Russia had already made $180 billion from oil sales and oil and gas sales. It is the largest producer of oil and gas outside the OPEC, and oil and gas is going to be relevant for several decades, if not more. The third thing is, as far as Russia is concerned, their narrative is not heard adequately in the world, including amongst us, because we are all pounded by Western-led narratives. Let me give you a piece of information that I've always held very dear, that, in the Gulf War 1 and 2, why America got it wrong, including Secretary of State Colin Powell going and making a presentation in the UN that Iraq had WMDs, weapons of mass destruction, when nothing was found there, because American State Department always set out the benchmarks of what they want the narrative to look like. And then every bloody analyst has to go out and produce a statement which looks good to the State Department. So America has more think tanks than the British Army has tanks. But the problem is they always get the wrong end of the stick because they've already decided what they're looking for. And their assessments are far from accurate. And they push countries and push situations into looking like what Foggy Bottom wants it to look like. Madam Meera Shankar would know that better than me. But the fact of the matter is that in today's world, you've got to get real. And getting real is about what is it that you want? You want to drive Russia back into a so-called rabbit hole? You think Russia will disappear overnight as a superpower? I might appear as a Russian sort of apologist, but that's not the point. I'm trying to give a reality check about what
this is true, Maroof. What you say is that the Russian side of the entire story has really, as far as the media coverage is concerned, it has been very lopsided towards the West, and we haven't heard from them enough. Meera Shankar, you tell us, where has the balance of power shifted since the war started? Russia and the West, they've had this eyeball-to-eyeball situation for a while. The situation came to a head when NATO looked like it was coming too close to Russian borders. In many ways, countries have been forced to take sides basis their own economic needs in this entire war. India, of course, is no exception. But how has the balance of power shifted, especially with news about China militarily helping Russia and the fact that a formidable coalition of Russia, of Turkey, China and Iran, they seem to be rising against the US?
Well, let me say that it's a very fluid situation. We don't know where the balance of power is finally going to end right now. But I would say that the US, because it's fighting a proxy war, it's not directly involved, it's supplying weapon systems, training, increasing the sophistication of weapon systems that it is supplying, imposing sanctions. It has achieved a number of its objectives. For instance, it has consolidated its leadership over NATO, which had been squandered to some extent under the Trump administration. It has severed the energy links between Russia and Europe, which was a key concern of the US, especially the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which was going to come into stream. And now Germany, which used to get almost 50% of its energy imports from Russia, is getting something like 10 to 20%. It's reduced the quantum of energy that it is buying from Russia. And finally, it has forced Europe to spend more on its defense, which has been a constant refrain of US presidents that Europe has had a free role and they need to step up expenditure to 2%, defense expenditure to 2% of GDP, so as to shoulder a greater part of the burden of defense of Europe. So I would say the US has achieved a number of objectives. It's also selling weapons
Exactly.
to Ukraine and to Europe.
Yes.
But at the same time, it's a war economy. So it's taking, I feel, its eye off the larger and main strategic competitor potentially in the future,
Right.
and that is China. So in some sense, I feel the US is fighting the last century's war.
Right.
Because it's like a spillover of the Cold War.
Yes.
Whereas it actually faces China as its real potential competitor
Right.
in the future.
Right.
And in this focus on Europe, it's taken its eyeballs off what would be its main challenge in the future.
Right.
Russia, on the other hand, has clawed back some of the territory that Ukraine had taken from it in recent weeks, actually. Yes. So it's a kind of ding-dong situation.
No, of course. Yes, and that's exactly the reason why this war doesn't look like it's going to end, and there are no clear winners or losers, and that situation is not going to change anytime soon from everything that we see and hear and what we're talking about. But Dr. Joshi, as far as your understanding is concerned, there are clearly some winners in this entire war situation that we're in. We wouldn't like them to be winners, but that's exactly what we're talking about, and started off by saying about the defense industry. But now, if you're looking at the possibility of an end of a war, as much as crystal ball gazing that you might have to do, what are the possible scenarios in which you see this war end?
Well, I can tell you one thing. The Russian offensive, the current Russian offensive has failed. They launched an offensive, their gains have been trivial. And here we can only analyze from scattered data, we can only analyze that the Russians simply don't have the manpower and the equipment to overwhelm the Ukrainians. Though they are, in terms of the size of the country, they are huge, but they just don't have the kind of an army, the size of an army, trained army, which can do the needful. So their offensive has failed. Now we are expecting the Ukrainian offensive. And many people say the Ukrainian offensive will be south towards Crimea. Let's see what happens in that. That's why I'm saying that the Russians have failed in this particular offensive. I'm sure they will launch yet another offensive. But, their handling of the war has been so incompetent. And the Ukrainians have actually shown considerable competence in this, in their counter offensives.
Right.
That's why I said that I think that by summer or so,
yes,
the mood should be better in Kremlin. And I'm looking at the most recent thing, whatever you may say about India, this and that, G20, and
Yes.
all sorts of claims about India's capabilities. The fact of the matter is, the blunt matter is that the key role, I suspect, will be played by China.
Right.
It is
Exactly.
China and the US
Yes.
which will work it out. It's in their mutual interest. They are the big rivals now.
Right.
They are the big rivals, but they also need to moderate the situation
Yes.
so that it doesn't get out of control.
Yes. So to
I think
find
they are
that
going to
mutual
work together.
interest that is going to help them point in the direction of ending the war, one wonders whether that has been found and whether there is a trajectory that the world powers are working towards. Putin, meanwhile, of course, as the rhetoric goes, is saying that this is a local war. It has become global. Indeed, it has. And even so, the duration of it, the fact that diplomacy is not being pursued, at least optically, it's not getting pursued, losses are mounting, life is being lost, economic fallouts are there. We just have to remain hopeful that this war is going to end soon, but clearly there are no indicators yet. Meera Shankar, Manoj Joshi and Maroof Raza, many thanks for joining us with your perspectives on India Tonight.
Thank you.
We will take a very quick breather on this edition of India Tonight, but much more coming